My people, called, known, created, freed, redeemed, liberated my people. How quickly you have forgotten our shared history, how swiftly you have reduced me to a god of apathy, neutral in the face of injustice. Do you not know me at all? For you perfect your religion like it's a play, getting on your knees to pray, memorizing your sermon lines, finding flawless harmonies to enhance your worship sets. Yet, off stage you underpay your employees and justify harsh inequality with your gospel of prosperity, silencing my prophets who proclaim liberation. Your offerings are a mockery when they've been gained through the pain and exploitation of others. Their bones cry out from the ground. The bones of the landless, the enslaved, the imprisoned, the oppressed, the bones of my people cry out from the ground. This ground whose cracks echo the ever-widening chasm between rich and poor. In spasm under the weight of injustice, creation groans, the land cries out for living waters to flow. This drought will not be remedied through trickle-down charity. Your last remaining hope is to seek me and live. The God who brought you up out of Egypt, seek me and live. The God who proclaims liberty to the captive, seek me and live. The God who is good news for the poor, seek me and live. That justice may roll down like mighty waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Wow, so much truth communicated with such eloquence and piercing, prophetic, poetic prose. Last week we were in Cape Town and caught up with poet and author of this poem, Thandi Gamedze, and Reverend René, a strategist, thought leader, disciple maker, speaker, author, co-conspirator, trainer, reconciler, and friend. René works for the Tier Fund UK and is part of the Justice Conference South African team. Hello and welcome to Context. My name is Themba Dlamini. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, thank you for taking the time out to join us. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing. Hit that little notification bell so you won't miss out on Context. Today's topic is stemming from Thandi's beautiful poem on Amos in the Bible. We dive into the complexities between law and justice. Is the law neutral and consequently just, or does it produce injustice in its application? Thandi's poem was written in 2018 and so prophetic when you consider the July lootings and the scourge of inequality in our land. If you are keen to listen to the full podcast and not just the summary on YouTube, you are most welcome to click on the link in the description below. In our summary today, we answer 3 questions. 1. What is the difference between law and justice? 2. Is God neutral in the face of injustice? And 3. If not, what does it mean for us as followers of Christ to live in a country riddled with socio-economic injustice? So let's get right into it. What is the difference between law and justice? Nicholas Wolterstorff, in his book Justice, helps us unpack this question. He says justice and righteousness are 2 words that appear often in the Bible, but many people misunderstand what they mean. When we hear the word justice, we may think of a criminal getting a punishment that he deserves. People say, I just want to see justice done. But the Hebrew word for justice, mishpat, has at its root meaning fairness and equity. When it is applied to criminal cases, justice in the Old Testament means that the judge does not take bribes and does not treat the poor worse than he treats the rich. Most of the time, the word mishpat has to do with justice for those we might call underprivileged, widows, the fatherless or orphans, immigrants, and the poor, what some have called the quartet of the vulnerable. Law and justice are not mutually exclusive, but are not the same thing either. A law that fails the quartet of the vulnerable, namely widows, the fatherless or orphans, immigrants, and the poor, biblically speaking, is still a law, but it is an unjust law. Number 2, is God neutral in the face of injustice? The long and short of it is no. Thandi and René assert that God is not neutral in the face of injustice. When the vulnerable are being oppressed and mistreated, God takes their side. Amos in the Bible repeatedly describes how angry God gets in the face of economic injustice. Now, before you label me as a communist, this is not a slight at capitalism or any other economic system for that matter, but rather whether or not the vulnerable are fairly treated or are being oppressed by that system. If our economy is perpetuating extreme inequality and oppressing the poor, God's anger is aroused. In the podcast, René gives an example of how a church in South Africa back in the day used its influence in the legal system to redraw the boundaries of church land, enlarging church territory and effectively stealing. Isn't this an unjust outcome? What do you think God thinks about this? Lastly, what does it mean for us as followers of Christ to live in a country riddled with economic injustice? As individual believers, whilst we cannot unilaterally change or influence the system, we need to examine our own complicity with an oppressive system. We need to ask the question of whether God is angry at the present economic injustice in South Africa. Have we individually and corporately as His body mistreated, exploited, and ignored the cries of the poor and vulnerable in our land? Amos, as cited in Thandi's poem, paints a vivid picture of what it looks like for God's people to walk and remain faithful to God in a covenantal relationship, making it clear that authentic worship and religion must be paired with just economic behavior. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Amos 5 verses 21 to 23. Our economic conduct and how it affects the poor and marginalized is and will always be a matter of Christian faithfulness. Have we conveniently, at the expense of the vulnerable, might I add, divorced our worship from our economic practices? To what extent might God be hurtful of our worship, of our preaching, singing, and offerings, given the ways the poor and marginalized are affected by our economic priorities and choices in South Africa? Both Thandi and René bring this into sharp focus, reminding us that our allegiance to God's reign and rule is not reserved only for the church building, but also for the marketplace. This is the heart of the gospel. Thandi ends our poem with Amos 5 verses 24. But let justice roll down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. This is a Bible verse Martin Luther King Jr. quoted most. The prophet Amos was saying, as most of the Hebrew prophets were saying, that what God wants is justice and right living rather than religious ceremonies for their own sake. If we simply do church and ignore the injustice in our society, we dishonor His name. Amos says that God finds a church like that disgusting. Bible scholars and commentators assert that there was scant rainfall in Israel during most of the year. Water was often scarce and drought was common. When meager rains eventually fell on the parched landscape, it could be difficult for the water to penetrate into the ground. Fast-running rainwater would create vigorous temporary rivers that carved large gullies and crevices called wadis into the ground. Amos probably has these wadis in mind when he indicates in verse 24 that justice must be a powerful force in Israel, like the waters that rush down the parched gullies. But unlike the wadis, which are dry and deserted most of the year, Amos does not merely want occasional just behavior in Israel. Rather, he wants righteous conduct to flow all the time, like an ever-flowing stream. In other words, justice and righteousness are not to be merely seasonal. When, for example, the people are ostensibly worshiping God or having some kind of religious festival. Rather, justice and righteousness must always flow like a river that never stops moving. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on economic injustices in South Africa? Has the prosperity gospel blinded us of seeing and acting against injustice and poverty? Perhaps it is something else that I didn't mention and you want us to engage on it. Leave a comment in the comment section below. Remember to like and share with whomever you think will benefit from this content. That's it for today. See you next time for part 2 of our conversation with René and Thandi. And thank you so much for listening, and salani kahle. Until next time, cheers. Bye-bye.